to you.
Great.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Lynn Maloney. Good evening.
Good evening. We're distributing Race Matters Friends report on community-oriented policing that we promised to you back in April. This is a living document that we've named it Policy Brief Number 1. As new information about CPD and the engagement process has continued ongoingly while we were writing this document, we consider it a work in progress that will continue to evolve in response to events in Columbia. In writing the history section of our report, we reviewed the reports written about CPD back in 2006 and again in 2012, and see that the chief has not affected change in response to these recommendations, nor has the chief's boss, the city manager, affected these recommendations yet in 2018. Whose job is it to create change recommended by paid consultants, change asked for by the community, change resolved and voted on by you, City Council? Council's excellent resolution for department-wide community-oriented policing in February of this year has so far resulted in a process of community engagement at which the chief has not engaged the public, but only last week explained that he does not see a need for his presence at these meetings. He does absolve himself of any role in meaningfully listening and engaging the community. In fact, the very process of preparing his plan for department-wide community-oriented policing, the city manager has further eroded trust. Trust, as you know, is one of the cornerstones of community-oriented policing. And I was pleased to read that during the listening tour, City Manager Mathis did mention that trust is actually something we should focus on. However, there are 3 particular ways in which the community engagement process he's created has eroded trust, the opposite of what we've all agreed we want. Firstly, the deflection of the conversation about what the community wants away from implementation of community-oriented policing towards the lack of funding available. In fact, the call for 50 more officers is one we hear about the current model of reactive policing and is not a concern related to community-oriented policing particularly. This deflection does not create trust. Secondly, trust has been eroded by CPD leadership repeatedly responding to racial disparities in the VSR data as reflective of poverty, not racial prejudice. Given the history of residential segregation policies, for example, the bulldozing in this town of black-owned homes and businesses in Sharp End, the history of real estate redlining causing residential segregation, and more, it is disingenuous to claim a lack of causal relationship between race and poverty. The historical economic divide among the races is a reason to be sensitive to disproportionate racial contact and not an excuse for it. Additionally, the majority of the impoverished population is white, so economic disparities are not an adequate answer to the question of disparate minority contact with CPD. Continually blaming poverty for the ever-increasing racial disparities in the VSR data does not build trust with the community. Trust has been further eroded by CPD's deflection away from questions of policy and toward actions of individual officers, denying the systemic nature of racial disparities. We do not seek to call any one officer racist because that will not change the disparities. We do seek an end to practices that unfairly target minorities, saturation policing, for example, as well as stopping black drivers when looking for a black suspect. Given that most crimes in Columbia are committed by whites, can you honestly imagine CPD stopping white drivers because they're seeking a white suspect? Hardly. These practices generate unfair, disproportionate contact. These practices erode and do not build trust. Council takes effective action every time you meet related to planning and zoning, related to parks and recreation. Yet when we look at the lack of effect of the recommendations of the 2006, the 2012 reviews of CPD, the lack of implementation of your MTFCV report, and the current trust-eroding impact of the process resulting from your February 2018 resolution, Council appears impotent to create change in policing. The Minneapolis Council is looking at changing city structure to allow council the ability to create policy change for their police department. What do we need in Columbia to make you all more powerful to affect change in policing? Councilman Scala told me I was naive to ask council to find ways to encourage the chief to take action or choose to leave. The city is not asking the chief to earn his salary. The city manager has not seen to the implementation of council's recommendation regarding policing in the past, and judging by the so-called community engagement process created in response to your 2018 resolution, he will not implement that resulting plan either. What do you have the power to do with regard to policing? We give you our report on implementing community-oriented policing as a template by which to measure the validity of the manager's plan, which he submits in August. But will our report, too, be met with inaction? Policing is not merely a profession. It is a political force in community. How do we as citizens direct our employees to provide public safety? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Maloney. I appreciate your input and your update. Next, we have Brian Johnson.